President Mohammed Hosni Mubarak has decided to waive the office of the President of the Republic and instructed the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces to run the affairs of the country. May God guide our steps.
Listen to that crowd. That's what they've been waiting for. Hosni Mubarak has gone.
As part of our Arab Spring series, we take a look at the events that shook the region at the beginning of 2011 and ask searching questions about where we are now. The Middle East today remains a cauldron of instability, yet the autocrats and their backers have successfully for now subverted a revolution that once filled Arab and Muslims with great hope. Over the coming weeks and months, I hope to interview a range of voices from differing sides of the political and age divide, with the hope that collectively we can find some answers. Has the Arab Spring turned into a deep winter? Have the autocrats won? Do we now see a failure of Islamic movements across the world? And if so, what will replace them? Last time I spoke to Dr Osman Bahkach, an activist and commentator, with his frank assessments of where we are now. I received a lot of feedback from the interview, mostly positive. Some found his conclusion sobering. Others criticised it for being too pessimistic. I suspect most people that have an interest in the Muslim world come to a topic like the Arab Spring with preordained assumptions and absolute conclusions. I hope through these interviews that we can all open our minds to some level of critical analysis, because only through this can we move forward and learn the mistakes of this past decade. My guest today is Dr. Azzam Tamimi. Dr. Tamimi is a Palestinian academic and activist and has for decades contributed to Islamic and political work. He has authored numerous books detailing his analysis on events in the Muslim world, including his doctoral thesis, which is now published on Amazon on Rashid Ghanouchi from An-Nahda Party, and a detailed history of Hamas. Dr. Tamimi currently hosts a show on Al-Hiwar TV. Dr. Tamimi, it's a pleasure having you with us today. The Arab Spring began, of course, in 2011, and it led to a lot of optimism, especially amongst I suppose those who endorse political Islam, which I would imagine, you would be one of them. And it seems to me that the Arab Spring has deteriorated. And we've seen Tunisia, we've seen Egypt, we've seen Syria. But for all intents and purposes, these countries have not moved forward beyond the dictatorships and petty disputes that they were embroiled in prior to 2011. So I suppose my first question is, how has the Arab Spring developed in your mind, and is it over?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Well, to start with, I don't like the term political Islam because I don't think it represents anything well defined. It's a very misleading term. But we'll come back to that maybe afterwards. Now, regarding the Arab Spring, now we understand that change in the Arab region, probably even in the Muslim world, will not happen in one go. It will happen in stages. Now, it is true that there was an air of optimism in the beginning. But I think retrospectively now we realize that the change aspired by the peoples of the region will not happen in one go. It will have to happen in waves or in stages, just like major revolutions in world history did. If we talk about the French Revolution, for instance, or other revolutions in Eastern Europe or in Latin America, they went through many stages that have to do with two things principally. on the one hand, the level of awareness among the population of the price that needs to be paid for such a change to take place. And on the other hand, the balance of power, whether it is local, regional, or international. And I think the balance of power in the Middle East has proven to be not in favor of the change. And that's why the counter-revolution managed to crush the Arab Spring. But that will only be temporarily. Temporary. There will be another wave. There will be another revival.
And what do you think is behind this counter-revolution? At the very start in 2011, there was an era of optimism, as you said, but also the power on the street was really irreversible. And it just seemed to me that no dictator, no president, no international body could now stand in the way of people power. So what sorts of forces have coalesced to prevent this revolution from bearing fruit?
Well, in the beginning, the popular revolution seemed unstoppable, but actually the reality was different, was something different. We discovered later on that the deep state was well entrenched, very powerful. There were so many interest groups within the country, within each of those countries, that didn't want to see a change because a change was detrimental to their own interests. Also, regional powers didn't want a change because they feared that a democratic transition in a big country like Egypt would immediately set a precedent and would attract attention in the rest of the region. Countries like Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates were particularly anxious about such a likelihood. And therefore they paid billions of dollars to local groups who were not in favor of the change. And as a result, the balance of power shifted massively against the popular revolution. Of course, there is an international element as well, but I don't think it's a major element. I think world powers outside the region were initially watching, maybe repositioning themselves to deal or to adapt to new realities. And I think America and Europe were prepared to deal with a new reality in which democracies were emerging across the region. But when they saw their own allies in Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and elsewhere stand in the face of those revolutions, they didn't mind that outcome. And that's why they did not protest against the coup in Egypt. They seemed in certain places like Libya and Yemen to collaborate with the anti-revolutionary forces because for them maintaining the status quo was a better option.
Now I want to go into some specifics. Let's start with Egypt. Firstly, the Mubarak fell and in 2011, and we had an election which led to the overwhelming support for Mohamed Mursi, who became president. But of course, he remained in government for only 1 year. Now, what went wrong with Mohamed Mursi? Was he naive about the extent to which he could change the system? Or were there other forces at play which prevented him from achieving his ends in government?
Sadly, Mursi perished without giving his testimony. And that's why much of what people say about him is mere prediction or analysis. Even people who were very close to him are either still in prison or have perished, or few of them are scattered around the world. So I think it will take some time for us to know the full story. Now, my analysis is that there is nothing Mursi or the Muslim Brotherhood could have done that would have prevented the coup from taking place. It's just a question of of a balance of power. This is very similar to what happened to Allende in Chile in 1973. An overwhelming local, regional, and international balance of power against change. And I think from what I heard from a few of Mursi's friends is that he was aware of the risks. But he and the Muslim Brotherhood were faced with very limited choices. They did not start the revolution, but they were forced to lead it. They didn't want to stand for presidential election, but they were left without choices, but to stand and nominate one of them because nobody else wanted to be nominated. That is from their side. They had about 6 or 7 nominees who were not members of the Muslim Brotherhood, but who were trusted individuals as far as they were concerned, and none of them agreed. It was before Mursi was elected, there was a fierce battle taking place behind the scene between the army, the military establishment, and the revolution. And the military establishment wanted to get rid of Mubarak, but also wanted to maintain, to remain in control of the revolution, so as to produce a president of their choice and to maintain the old regime. The election of Mursi spoiled it for them, and they had to go on the offensive, really harsh. And in that, they were aided by Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, and eventually even by the Western world.
I want to understand what was the reluctance behind not standing initially in the presidential elections. I mean, the Muslim Brotherhood for many decades was the strongest Islamic group, the strongest party in Egypt, and had real people power and people support. So why did the Ikhwan, the Muslim Brotherhood, decide that initially, at least, standing in the elections was a bad idea?
The most troubling thing for the Muslim Brotherhood was not really the military establishment inside Egypt at the time, not even regional and international powers, but rather partners in the revolution. Other partners in the revolution, especially people who describe themselves as liberals, or people who describe themselves as socialists and Naserists, all became suspicious of the Muslim Brotherhood and started creating some sort of an image of a group that was only interested in stealing the revolution from everybody else. So the Muslim Brotherhood were keen to dispel that sort of illusion. And that's why they didn't want a president to come from within the Muslim Brotherhood, just to prove that they were not really as ambitious as the other groups were portraying them. So they came up with what they believe to be a good solution. Let's nominate someone who is acceptable to everybody, to almost everybody. So they had a list of about 6 or 7 people, and they started contacting them. The Muslim Brotherhood were hoping that the political system in Egypt would become parliamentary rather than presidential, because the Egyptians have always complained from the presidential system, in which a president monopolized power and did whatever he wanted. They wanted something similar to the British system, where parliament produced government, an elected parliament produces an accountable government. But then they were told by someone in the army that no matter what they did, they were not going to get what they wanted, because the Constitutional Court was getting ready to dissolve parliament. So even an elected parliament was going to be dissolved. So they went back to square one and decided to reconsider the presidential option. And when nobody from amongst the friends they nominated wanted to be shortlisted, they decided to nominate one of their own. So initially they nominated Khairat al-Shatir, but Khairat al-Shatir was disqualified by the court, which was under military influence. And then they had Mursi as a reserve candidate, and he eventually ended being elected. And actually, I was really surprised. I didn't expect Mursi to do so well, and I think he was doing so well that the military were being pressured by Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates to effect the coup as soon as possible. And the defense minister at the time, Sisi, kept saying to them, "It's too early. I still cannot do it. Give me some more time." Until Mursi nearly completed the first year, they came to the conclusion that if they left Mursi for another year or two, or if he were to complete his term, the successes he was likely to achieve were going to establish democracy beyond anybody's attempt to undermine it or undo it.
So Mohamed Mursi initially had overwhelming support, and that's obviously the case. He won the election and he became the president of the country. But of course, something changed. Within a year, the optimistic mood turned pessimistic, and we had demonstrators out again against Mursi's government. And there seemed to be a decline in his in the quality of life in Egypt, and public services were eroding. And so did Mohamed Mursi, in a way, fail to govern? And is that an indictment then of the Muslim Brotherhood, that this organization that had been out of power for such a long time, when it came to it, they just weren't able to meet the demands, the ordinary demands of the people?
Well, the deep state and its supporters in the region and outside the region wanted to create the impression that Mursi was failing. And that's why state institutions were not functioning. Every effort was being made to paralyze the country. Even the police force was not working. You couldn't see police in the streets. Even traffic wardens were staying at home. So he was trying his best in a battle that was so fierce and so in favor of his enemies. So how do we measure success or failure? You measure success or failure on the basis of what obstacles you were facing and you were trying to surmount. And I think he did very well if we take the obstacles he was facing into consideration. And I always say that if he was really failing, they should have left him to be exposed, so that people would choose willingly to not elect him the next time, or as they took to the streets first, they take this to the streets again and bring down the government. But even the 30th of June rallies were staged by the military. The numbers were exaggerated. The Coptic church was a principal factor in this, because the Copts were intimidated and were terrified. They were told that if the Muslim Brotherhood ruled Egypt, that would be the beginning of the end of Christianity in Egypt, and all sorts of nonsense. The media played a major role, because much of the media was funded by Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. And they were exploiting the freedom given to them during Mursi's time to have a go at him. I mean, look at today, for instance. Nobody dares mention a word against Sisi inside Egypt without risking being killed or imprisoned, You can compare the two situations.
But didn't Mursi represent a greater goal? Now, we may contest the term political Islam, but of course, the Muslim Brotherhood represented a greater ideal, and that is to incorporate Islam into normative political life. And many believers in Egypt voted for Mursi, hoping not just for an improvement in their basic livelihoods and services. Of course, that's an element of it, but also because they saw Mursi as someone who represented believers and represented Islam. And so in his failure, in inverted commas, we may have also seen a failure of political Islam.
Well, it's totally wrong, of course. You're making assumptions that are totally wrong. There is no failure. How can we say they failed when there was a coup barely a year after Mursi was in power?
Dr. Tamimi, you follow the events really closely, and you obviously have connections with members of the Muslim Brotherhood on the ground in Egypt. Can you tell us what the status is of the Muslim Brotherhood? I mean, after the counter coup from Sisi, we know of the massacres and the mass arrests that took place of Brotherhood members. Is there still a party called the Muslim Brotherhood, and can it regenerate in the coming years and contribute to the future of Egypt?
Well, at the moment, the Muslim Brotherhood is non-existent in the public domain because they've been banned, eradicated nearly. They're either imprisoned. There are about 50,000 of them imprisoned, and many have been driven underground or driven out of the country. But that doesn't mean that opposition to the regime is non-existent. It does exist, and we see from time to time that opposition flare up and people take to the streets despite the heavy crackdown.
Right. Let's turn then to Syria. The Syrian revolution again was a hope for many. It began as a relatively peaceful, as a very peaceful revolution. Civil society actors marched on the streets and asked for an end to the regime. But of course, it quickly turned into something other than what it initially started as. And I think it's fair to say now that Assad has successfully maneuvered himself into victory.
I think two major events resulted in aborting the Syrian revolution. First, the militarization of the revolution. That was a fatal mistake. I personally kept warning against it because this is what Bashar al-Assad wanted to happen. He even deliberately released from Sadnaya prison a number of hardcore extremists who were previously sent by him actually to Iraq to fight against the Americans, because he knew those guys were extremely militant. They knew only one way to oppose the regime, and that is to carry arms. Saudi Arabia also released a number of its hardcore extremists from prison upon the condition that they head to Syria, and they ended up in Syria. So there was a collaborative effort to militarize the revolution so that Bashar al-Assad's claim that he was fighting terrorism would stand and would provide him with a justification to invite in the Iranians and the Russians, which changed the game completely. And that's why a year after the Syrian revolution, we started seeing even Western positions change. I remember initially the British, the French, many European countries were in favor of the revolution. The British themselves encouraged many Muslim Britons to go to Syria. either to provide aid or provide whatever it is. They were not really against fighting the regime in whatever way. But then the Americans stepped in a year later, and I think pressured the Europeans to change their position. First, because the revolution had been militarized, and secondly, because the fall of the regime would pose a threat to Israel, because it would create a vacuum that nobody knew who would rush into filling it. So Israel was the main concern for the Western powers. The second thing that happened is the coup in Egypt. The coup in Egypt ended the Arab dream in peaceful transition to democracy. And that's why immediately after the coup in Egypt in July 2013, Daesh or ISIS emerged. Prior to that, there were remnants of Al-Qaeda here and there. But then ISIS came out in force because the abortion of the peaceful march towards a change in the region provided ISIS and every other militant with the powerful justification that peaceful efforts don't work, only carrying arms works. So this is what led to the catastrophe that we see in Syria today.
Is it right to say, Dr. Tamimi, that ISIS has left an indelible mark on the Muslim masses? ISIS created what it called its self-styled caliphate, and it professed to rule by Sharia. And as a result, international public opinion, if it wasn't antagonistic towards Islam, it's very much so now. But not only opinion in Western countries, even in Muslim countries, many Muslims now find the idea of an Islamic party or an Islamic form of governance to be unbearable because of the forces it may unleash.
Well, ISIS is a phenomenon that is not unprecedented in the history of Islam. It's a very violent protest movement, and violent protest movements have existed throughout history. And now to blame Islam or Muslims or other Islamic movements for what ISIS portrayed or has done is a grave injustice, because ISIS considered the Muslim Brotherhood to be infidels. Did not believe they were representatives of Islam, did not accept their adherence to peaceful democratic means of change. And I think ISIS at one stage was an opportunity for many regimes in the region to manipulate it for their own ends, until it became clear that it wasn't possible to manipulate it anymore, because if you touched it, you burn your hands because of their violence, because of their extremism, etc. But initially, they were infiltrated by different intelligence agencies in the region, and each intelligence agency was seeking to influence the decision-making within the top ranks of ISIS. And that might have worked initially, but eventually it didn't work.
So in the Muslim countries, we now have large populations that are young. Some say in Arab countries, 60% of the Muslim masses are now under the age of 25. And these populations are looking for prospects. They're looking for some part to play in their country's future. They're seeking to establish a better country for themselves. And I suppose the Syrian revolution was a youthful revolution, and for all the reasons you explained, it's now been ultimately unsuccessful. Do you see any hope for the Arab world in the near future?
Well, definitely there is a lot of hope, and I'm always hopeful. as I mentioned earlier, change will take place in stages or in phases. And we've seen one phase. Now we are witnessing the beginning of the second phase. Look at what has happened in Algeria, in Sudan, and now in Lebanon, recently also in Egypt. This will not stop. And I think the young generation is learning lessons. People are learning lessons. Algeria, for instance, which saw in the late 90s bloodshed that lasted for nearly a decade and the loss of no less than 250,000 lives. I think that the new generation has come out with a clear lesson that only peaceful demonstrations and peaceful protests can deliver. We saw the same thing in Sudan. Now we are seeing it in Lebanon. Eventually, this will spread elsewhere, simply because dictatorship is making things worse across the region. There will not be development. There will not be any progress anywhere in the Arab world without freedom. People are fighting for their freedom now. Let them have their freedom and then decide what sort of governments they want, what sort of laws they want to be ruled by. The Muslim world, or the Arab world in particular, has been deprived of freedom since colonial times. And this is what the fight is about today. It's about freedom.
But is this at the expense of Islam? I mean, it seems to me that the recent experiences of the Muslim world, whether it's the short-lived experience of Egypt and the Mursi government, or the way by which ISIS has been characterized in its ultimate repression, this has left a mark upon the Muslim masses that you can call for change, but that change cannot have an Islamic character. And so do you see the future in the Arab world, or to be one where Islam is left out of the narrative?
Islam can only flourish in an atmosphere of freedom. And this is a challenge. Why are these dictators not allowing people to have their freedom? These masses are Muslim, overwhelmingly Muslim. I have no fear for Islam or for the Muslims. Let them choose freely. Even if they make a choice which is un-Islamic, Islam will come back. Much of the Arab world has succumbed to secularism, not out of choice. It has succumbed to forms of liberalism, not out of choice. Liberalism in really very, very crude terms, not in terms of freedoms. To forms of socialism, not out of choice. Let us have the choice and let people elect their governors, elect their representatives.
But is there another tendency in the Muslim world that we need to be more wary of, and that is the strong man imposing social and economic liberal reforms, and in the process creating some level of superficial prosperity? Capitalism flourishes for a period, and that young population that has felt that repression calm down and begin to see that these reforms are having a positive impact on their lives. And if for example, in Saudi Arabia, the strong man is imposing social and economic liberal reforms, and ultimately, if he's successful, doesn't that set back any project for Islam in the region?
Well, had there been reform, yes, but there is no reform in Saudi Arabia. You have one man who jails whoever disagrees with him, who seizes the properties and the wealth of people he perceives as a threat to his own power. The only liberalization he is allowing is concerts. And this is just ridiculous. Apart from that, even women who fought for the right to drive cars are today in prison. So there's really nothing good about the policies adopted by Mohammed bin Salman today. So eventually Saudi Arabia will explode. In the past, Saudi Arabia adopted a form of a very strict religiosity that was imposed on the population, and that backfired. It doesn't work. You cannot impose Islam. Islam has to be by conviction, by choice. La ikraha fi din. There is no compulsion on religion. Anybody, any government, any authority that seeks to compel Islam on the people will fail. Now he is compelling something, the opposite of Islam, on the people, and neither will work. It won't work.
I'm interested in an earlier point you made about political Islam. So when I used that term, you found that somewhat problematic. I mean, why do you find the term a problem?
People who coined the term political Islam assume that there are forms of Islam, that there is social Islam, that there is economic Islam, there is political Islam, there is apolitical Islam. This is nonsense. I mean, any reading of the Quran will tell you that Islam is a way of life. Politics is part of life. Economics is part of life. Social order is part of life. Islam is all of this. Islam is a set of moral, is a code of morality governing all aspects of life. So to assume that a group like the Muslim Brotherhood is only representative of an aspect of Islam, but not the rest of Islam, is intended to portray it in a negative way. This is one thing. The other thing is that the term political Islam combines contradictions together. ISIS is part of political Islam, and we saw what ISIS does to others. Whereas the Muslim Brotherhood, for instance, believes in democracy, believes in moderate, gradual reform. So how can you put all of this in one basket? To the extent that that in the aftermath of the coup in Egypt, so many so-called Islamists wanted to stay away from the term political Islam, claiming that they had nothing to do with it, that they were never part of it. And this is really a term that is used to intimidate others.
And in a recent interview, Dr. Tamimi, you mentioned that the Sykes-Picot borders that currently divide the Muslim world are irrelevant and superficial, and these entities are very weak and don't really define the mindset of the current Muslim Ummah. Can you explain what you meant by that?
They are. These entities were carved by the colonial powers. There are no natural borders between these states. The same peoples live everywhere. Look at my own tribe, for instance, the Tamimis. We are all over the place, from Iraq all the way to Morocco, from the Persian Gulf to the Atlantic Ocean. And there are all sorts of other tribes as well. And my conviction is that once the peoples of the region have their freedom, one of the things they will be looking up to do is remove these borders. I mean, if the Europeans, with all their different languages and different cultures and different histories, came together and created the European Union, despite Brexit and what's likely to happen after Brexit. Now, we, the Arabs, and we generally, the populations of that region, have been without borders for centuries. And it's humiliating for us to be separated in this way. Not only that, the entities created by the colonial powers, especially the British and the French, between the First War and the Second War, the First World War and the Second World War, were designed so that in one place you have lots of population, but very few resources, while in other places you have so much resources but no populations. I mean, look at the oil countries. They are scarcely populated, to the extent that 3/4, if not more, of their populations are imported labor forces from from Southeast Asia, from South Asia, from Africa, from elsewhere. Whereas a country like Egypt, which has 100 million population, does not have much resources. So if you imagine that one day we have the United Arab States or the United States of the Middle East without borders, and we have all these resources, whether they are water resources or oil resources or other minerals, where we have a big market, we have a huge source of talent as well. This is potentially a great superpower. And the reason why the status quo is favorable for Western powers is because changing it will potentially allow the emergence of a competitive superpower in that part of the world.
Creating a competitive superpower in the Muslim world would, of course, raise alarm bells in Washington and other Western capitals. Do you believe that they would even permit any tendency towards Arab or Muslim unification?
It doesn't matter what the Americans or the Europeans or the Russians or the Chinese want. It doesn't matter, because they are after their own interests, and they see their own interests in their own way. I think what really matters is what we want to happen to us. And that's why initially in 2011, the Americans and the Europeans had no option, had no choice but to welcome the change happening in the region and to begin accommodating it and adapting to it. If we, the peoples of the Arab world, choose to be free and choose to be united and choose to be independent, the rest of the world will have no choice but to deal with us. I mean, look at America and China. Of course, they are competing powers, but they play it in the realm of economics and realm of politics. The same with Russia and Europe, or Russia and the United States of America. So nothing will happen to the world if we are united and we emerge as a power. Eventually, we will have to deal with the world. And I think if the Western world in particular is cured from its misconceptions about Islam and the Muslims, we will end up having a much better world than the one we are living in today.
I mean, these are certainly weighty issues, the issue of unification. And of course, for such plans to be considered, there needs to be an open discussion and debate in the Muslim world about that. And space needs to be created for that. And you know, if anything, the space is shrinking in Muslim societies, not increasing. And then there's a broader context. Of course, we can't divorce the Muslim world from the international great powers and the forces at play. In America, at the moment, especially under Trump, but going forward, I think under all political hues, prefers a Muslim world that lives under the strongmen who rule by fear.
No, it's not the Americans that are the problem, in my opinion. The problem are the despots, the minority authoritarian regimes across the Muslim world. These corrupt rulers don't want to lose the privileges they've managed to gain throughout the past years by enslaving the entire population. And that's why we had the Arab Spring. That's why people are rising up and revolting and rebelling, because they want their freedom. The first wave was crushed. There will be a second wave, and there will be a third wave until the peoples of the region are free. I do make a distinction between the overwhelming majority of the people of the Middle East and the minority elites that govern them by force. Of course, those who are in power don't want a change to happen, and they use everything at their disposal in order to prevent it. But eventually, the flood of the masses will sweep them away.
But of course, these minority elites, have behind them, of course, not in a conspiratorial way, but of course have support from Western powers, and that level of support enables them to commit their crimes. I mean, Sisi would not have got away with half of what he did without the tacit approval of both the Obama and Trump administrations. Just think about Mohammed bin Salman and the approval he gains from the Americans. I mean, he can kill a journalist in an embassy in another country, and things are business as usual. And his image took a slight blip, but it's back to business as usual on the international scale. So there seems to be, a connection between Western powers and these corrupt elites that plague the Muslim world.
Of course, there is a connection, because Western powers believe that these despots are their best choice. But if that choice is no longer available, they will have to go to a second best choice. And I think it's up to us, up to the masses. And Sisi is in power today, not because of the Americans, not because of the Obama administration, and not because of the Trump administration. He is in power today because the elites in Egypt came together to suppress the Muslim Brotherhood, because they were somehow convinced at one stage that the Muslim Brotherhood were the enemy. They preferred a military dictatorship to a democracy ruled by an Islamic movement. And now people are learning the lesson. It doesn't matter who comes through the ballot box. Whoever comes through the ballot box will go through the ballot box. But those who come through bullets will not go easily.
And finally, Dr. Tamimi, from this discussion, I can tell that you remain very optimistic about the future of the Muslim world.
I am a Muslim, and a Muslim has to be an optimist. We are in this world on a mission of making it a righteous world, calling to the way of Allah, advising people to renounce evil, enjoin the good, and forbid the bad. This is our mission. This is what we are here in this life for. Eventually, we are going to die. This life is temporary, it's very short compared to what comes afterwards. And therefore, we have to continue the struggle. Nothing puts us off. Nothing makes us desperate or pessimistic. It's a struggle. It's a continuous struggle. And what we see today is part of that struggle. And as I told you earlier, there was one wave, there will be a second wave, and probably a third wave, until things are put right again across the Muslim world.
Next time we speak to Iyad al-Baghdadi and get his perspectives on the Arab Spring, a commentator and activist that many of you would know of. But until next week, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.